the recording before I do that? Thank you. And please direct your questions to the chat box, and we will get to them at the end of the seminar here. So Dr. Eddie Hazelton is going to be talking about examining Hurricane Dorian's early intensification and long-term track evolution through an ensemble of the hurricane analysis and forecast system. Andy, take it away.
Thank you, Shirley, and thank you to everyone who joined today. Looking forward to talking about some of the research I've been working on over the last year or two, project looking at Dorian's early intensification and long-term track evolution. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my collaborators, Gus Alaka, Michael Fisher, Gopal at AOML, and Dr. Ryan Torn from SUNY Albany. So just to kind of provide a background for many of you may remember Hurricane Dorian. It was 2019, formed from a small wave in the central Atlantic that maybe early on didn't look like a whole lot, but by the time it got done, it was the second strongest hurricane ever on record in the Atlantic Basin at a peak intensity of 160 knots. There's some background noise, so maybe you could just mute your phone if you're not, if you don't need to use it. Question. And so Dorian then rapidly intensified and stalled in the Bahamas, as you know. Unfortunately, that caused significant devastation in Great Abaco and Grand Bahama, a lot of storm surge and wind damage. It turned before Florida, but did cause a lot of flooding and some issues in the Outer Banks of North Carolina as well. So it was a very high impact case for a lot of people. And the other aspect of Dorian that was kind of important was some of the forecast challenges. In real time, you can see on the left there, many of the models that were kind of initialized sort of early on, 5-6 days ahead of when it was approaching the U.S. Many of the models initialized early there did not expect the storm to intensify. They kind of expected, a lot of the models showed it to kind of dying out or staying weak over the Eastern Caribbean, which is sort of a climatological, the climatologically favored solution, and a lot of the guidance was showing that. And so sort of this initial rightward deviation and intensification was unexpected by most of the guidance. And even a lot of the ensemble sets from this early period, you can see that the CIMAS ensemble, for example, initialized at August 27th at 0Z, really didn't capture much of the observed evolution very well. So it was a unique case. It was a unique forecast challenge in this early period, and so it's a case that we're really excited and interested to dig into it and see what we can learn about it. Whoops, there we go. So this we're going to use to study Dorian. It's the Hurricane Analysis and Forecast System, or HAFS. May have heard of it. It's part of NOAA's Unified Forecast System, or UFS. Specifically, it's the hurricane application that's being developed. It's an FE3 based modeling system, so FE3 dynamical core. It's been tested in real time during the 2019, 2020, and 2021 Atlantic hurricane seasons through collaborations between EMC, AOML, and GFDL and other labs. And right now, tentatively, a version of HAFS is scheduled to be implemented operationally during the 2023 hurricane season. So it's working. We're working hard doing a lot of development, and it's will be an operational hurricane model hopefully in the near future. So the setup that was used for this particular study was the global nested version of HAFS. The 2019 version, similar to what was running in real time during the 2019 Atlantic hurricane season. So what this version is, it's a two-way feedback between the static Atlantic nest at 3 kilometers and then a lower resolution global simulation at 13 kilometers, similar to what the GFS runs at right now. So you see you have this large static Atlantic nest that we're running at 3 kilometer resolution. It's initialized using the global fields because we're running the global nested version. We initialized at August 27th at 0 UTC. So again, when Dorian was kind of right near or just east of the Lesser Antilles. And for the physics, it's using the GFDL microphysics. This version was using the EDMF PBL physics with some hurricane modifications, pretty similar to what's in HWRF. There's been some other PBL upgrades since then that we've been working on, but that's the version that was used here. And it's an 80-member ensemble. It's created from using the 80 GDAS members from the GFS ensemble. Again, we're using global fields, so we can use all 80 of those and create a nice large ensemble to study what was going on with Dorian. So then the the next thing we're going to show is the overall ensemble results, just to kind of get our bearings for how the ensemble represented Dorian overall. So as you can see, it was a fairly dispersive set for both track and intensity. You had tracks at the end ranging from all the way almost in the Gulf, the west coast of Florida, to some that turned, along 75 west and a lot in between. The intensities also ranged, especially in those first few days, from anything from a tropical storm or a weak tropical storm to a major hurricane. So it wasn't a perfect ensemble by any means. You can see that during this period, just north of the Antilles, the observed track was kind of on the right side of the ensemble suite. Later on, that was a little more in the middle, so kind of a better representation later. Certainly not perfect, but it did, it produced a lot of spread and did a pretty reasonable job representing the overall range of possibilities for Dorian at this point. And so it's a useful set, I think, especially to study the early intensification in the Eastern Caribbean here, and then the long-term track in the Western Atlantic. So the first part that we're going to focus on is that early intensification, and some of these results were summarized in a paper came out about a year ago, or a little under a year ago in Atmospheres. So check that out if you want to see more details. And so one of the things that seemed pretty clear from at least visually looking at these tracks and intensity was that there seemed to be a connection between the track and intensity errors in the early period. That the ones that were the members that were further right seemed to be stronger. This seemed to be consistent with that those model biases we saw earlier. And sure enough, when we looked at correlations, there was indeed in those first 2 to 3 days a statistically significant relationship between the intensity bias of the members and the cross-track errors. So basically, the ones that were further right, closer to the observed track, were also stronger, closer to the observed intensity. What was interesting about that was that that relationship then dropped off later on, and that'll become more important when we talk about the track evolution later. But for that early period, there was definitely a track and intensity connection. So the question, of course, is, was this environmental? Was being further northeast somehow environmentally more favorable? Was it a structural issue? Or was it both? And that's the question that we're going to hope to answer. So the first thing we looked at was looking at some of these large-scale variables. So these are basically similar to what's calculated in the statistical hurricane intensity prediction scheme, or SHIPS. Basically, just these large-scale variables calculated from that ensemble data. And we did a correlation between that and the intensity at 42 hours. So basically, the intensity as it was just east of Puerto Rico or near Puerto Rico, starting initialization and going out to 42 hours. So we have different variables, shear in a couple different layers, relative humidity, some upper level divergence in wind fields, and then some upper level temperature fields. What was interesting was that if you look at this dark red line, you see that the deep layer shear really had a pretty low correlation, wasn't all that significant. So it wasn't really a case where there was any kind of large scale deep layer shear differences between the members that was affecting Dorian. The mid-level shear did show more signal. There was some relationship that was significant there. And the kind of the strongest ones were some of the mid to upper level humidity predictors, and also the upper level divergence. So there were some environmental factors that seemed to be more favorable in certain locations, as we'll see in a second. So looking specifically at that upper divergence, this is what we did for this analysis: is we composited the 20 strongest and 20 weakest members. So again, based on where the 20 strongest and 20 weakest when it was in this area just as it approached Puerto Rico. The shading is the height difference, 200 millibar height difference between the strongest and weakest strong member and weak member composites. And then also the vector wind difference is also shown. The green hatching is the green contouring is areas that are statistically significant based on our t-test. And so what you see is that even at initialization and continuing over time, there was a signal for stronger ridging and more upper divergence, especially kind of to the north and east initially, and then to the north of the TC as it moved into the Caribbean. And that difference, you can see it, in the vector wind differences, you have this stronger anticyclone kind of on the northeast side, and basically more upper divergence, stronger upper level anticyclone to the northeast and over the TC in the stronger members. And it seems like the signal kind of grows over time, as you might expect. So maybe it's a positive feedback with convection helping to amplify that upper level anticyclone. And if we look at that another variable that was shown to be significant was the moisture. So this is, again, composites of those 20 weakest and 20 strongest members. The red and blue circles are the position of Dorian. So this is 0 hours and 24 hours, and then a 42-hour position is shown here. So those are the composites of the weaker and stronger groups. So you see there's not a whole lot of mid-level moisture difference. Initially, it's kind of stochastic, but within 24 hours, you see that there's a pretty clear signal where there's a lot more moisture to the northeast of the TC on the northeast side for the stronger group, and drier on the southwest side. So what that was interesting is that it suggests that more moisture on that northeast side kind of favored a stronger and more rightward moving TC, as we saw. Some of this may be position differences, but the mean position differences are pretty small, early on there. So it definitely suggests that there's an environmental difference in the large scale moisture. And what this seemed to favor some of the vortex redevelopment and formation on the northeast side. And that's consistent with some of the observational analysis that's been done in Dorian by Trey Alvey and others. And we'll look at a little bit more of the vortex scale processes that contributed as well in a minute. So to get it into more details, to look at some of the real detailed structural processes that affected Dorian in this early intensification, we look at two representative members, basically kind of case studies. One was a strong member that pretty much followed the best track for those first 2 days, and was right to the northeast of Puerto Rico, intensifying. And then a second member that was a lot weaker, further southwest, went to the west of Puerto Rico, and that one's kind of a good null case. That's sort of similar to what a lot of the operational guidance was showing at this time. And what you can see is that they're pretty similar for the first 24 hours or 18 hours, and then kind of diverge here west of St. Lucia and Martinique. So just to look briefly at the synoptic differences between them, to see were there any large scale differences that stand out. Really, when you look at the synoptic pattern, this is a 200 millibar potential vorticity. On the left is the weaker member, on the right in the middle is the stronger member, and the difference plot is on the right. So overall, the synoptic pattern is pretty similar. It's not like there's any huge differences that stand out. There are some subtle differences where, if you look at the difference plot, the PV streamer is a little bit closer to the TC in this weaker member, and when you combine that with the TC already being a little bit further west, maybe it was a little bit more unfavorable of an upper level pattern. But overall, it's not a huge difference. It's not like there's any major features that are different between the two. But what was different was the structure. So what we have here are comparisons between the two different ensemble members and then P3 radar data, because one of the advantages of looking at Dorian from a research perspective is that there was a lot of observational data. I believe it was the most P3 flights ever in an Atlantic TC. I was actually on 6 of them, basically following it from down just east of Barbados up into the Bahamas. So there was a lot of data, data to compare the model with and evaluate what was going on in the storm. So what we have is the left column is, precipitation, and basically kind of low to mid-level precipitation with the wind vectors there as well. And then the right column is the wind speed at 750 millibars shaded, and then you have streamlines at low and mid levels to look at vortex tilt. So the top row is the weaker member, the middle row is the stronger member, and then on the bottom row we have here the P3 radar data. So what you can see is that they're at this 24-hour period, they're both vortices are a little bit tilted. We saw that in observations as well. There was some misalignment between the 2 and 5 kilometer centers. But what we saw in the stronger member was you had more convection and stronger thunderstorms kind of starting to wrap around the low-level center at this point. And that's more consistent with what was seen in observations. You had a lot more precip symmetry in observations. So it seemed like there was already some differences in how the structure was evolving by this point. And if you go about 24 hours later, this is the next flight, and the model members have really diverged by this point. So now the weak member, it's still very tilted with a very broad and weak vortex and not much precip symmetry. Whereas in the strong member, now you see there's this small but very robust inner core that's developed with the precip and an eye wall wrapping all the way around. I believe it was a minimal hurricane by this point. And then, and if you look at the P3 radar data, that is exactly what was observed. You had this, this kind of, you had this outer precip that had some asymmetry, as you'd expect, but the inner core was small but very robust and symmetric. What's interesting is if you look at the deep layer shear, it's very similar between these two. So it wasn't like we said, there weren't any major large scale shear differences. Maybe some slight mid-level shear, but overall it seemed like it was really the vortex and convective scale that seemed to be a big difference between these two, and allowing that small, robust inner core. And like I mentioned earlier, this observational study that just came out by Trey Alvey and some others also showed how they used a ground-based radar, P3 radar, and a lot of different kind of observational data to also show how important this inner core development was. So basically, it seems like what the model was showing was consistent with what the observations were also telling us about Dorian. So another way to look at some of the structure, I mentioned the vortex tilt. What was interesting is if you compare the two members, they both initially had a pretty strong vortex tilt. So what these plots are is, this is from HAFS. This is on the top is the weak member, on the bottom is the strong member at 0 and 24 hours. The colors are the center locations at different heights. So the reds are lower levels and the blues go to upper levels. So you see initially both members were pretty tilted from west to east with height. If anything, the strong member was actually a little more tilted initially. So it doesn't look like it was an initial vortex difference was the big driver. It's how these two evolved. Because if you look at 24 hours, just a day into the forecast, the weak member is still very tilted, misaligned, whereas the strong member now is pretty much aligned all the way up to almost 250 millibars. And so those convective and vortex scale differences that allowed it to get aligned quickly really seem to be a big factor in allowing that, ending up on the right side of the guidance and stronger here. So to look at some of those convective processes in a little more detail, what we did is we applied a precipitation partitioning algorithm to the model data and also the observational data. I won't get into too many details of the algorithm here, but basically it's a way to look at different precipitation types, separate out shallow, moderate, and deep convection, and also stratiform convection. So those are the 4 different colors here. So on the top is the weaker member, and then the bottom is the stronger member. The time series are from the model data, and then the stars are from the observational data. So kind of what stands out is that if you look at the weaker member, you have this big spike in convection around hour 33. So there was this big convective pulse, but it never really symmetrized, because what this time series represents, it's the closure. It's how much of the eye wall or the core of the storm is enclosed by each precipitation type. So you get this big spike of convection that tried to wrap around but failed to symmetrize, and so basically the storm just kind of pulsed and stayed weak. Whereas if you look at the stronger member, it was pretty similar in the first 18 hours, but then around hour 24, you get this pulse and deep convection that symmetrized. And if you look at especially the shallow and moderate convection, how that evolved later, it seemed like that increase in convective symmetry was able to persist in the stronger member and was closer to what we saw in observations by the end. So it was the difference between the pulsing convection and the convection that was able to wrap around, symmetrize, and align the vortex that really seemed to be what allowed Dorian to intensify in this early period. And so to look at some more details of how that process and how that convective convection was helping to spin up the vortex, what we did next is looked at a tangential wind tendency for the strong and weak members. So this is the sum of the terms for both the weak member on the left and then the strong member on the right. This is at 15 hours, so this is kind of before they really started to diverge. And the black dotted lines, black dots here, are the radius of maximum wind at different heights. You can see, it was a fairly broad vortex, a lot of tilt at low levels. But what you see is that from this tendency equation, the sum is that as you'd expect, the stronger member on the right there had a lot stronger positive tendency. It seemed to be more focused at low levels. Kind of seemed to be a bottom-up process that was going on. So if we go to the next slide, what this shows is the terms from that tangential wind tendency equation. The top left is the mean horizontal advection term. This is the mean vertical advection term on the top right. This is the eddy flux term, or the eddy advection, the eddy radial flow advecting eddy tangential wind. and then this is the vertical eddy term. So early on, at least, this mean horizontal advection term wasn't really important. It was the two vertical advection terms and also the eddy flux term that were really dominant in that positive spin up. And what that really suggests is that asymmetric processes, so this convection and asymmetric vorticity generation, were really the processes that were dominant in helping Dorian to spin up at this early period. And the bottom up nature here that we see with this tendency really suggests that it was this convection from the bottom up, sort of helping the vortices become aligned with height, and then that precip wrapped around and it was able to sort of get in that more favorable environment on the northeast side of the TC and intensify further. So what I'm going to do now is just to show the vorticity evolution between the two members to further highlight the contrast. So I'll play the weak one first. Whoops. Let's see if we can get it to play. Here we go. So you can see that there's some little pulses with convection, but overall it stays pretty weak. I'll play it one more time. Pretty weak and broad and diffuse. Whereas if you look at the strong member now, you see after it moves to the lee of Martinique, the vorticity really spikes up and stays stronger. We didn't really, in this particular study, we didn't dig in too much detail into how much the terrain impacted this possible reformation. I did do one kind of brief analysis where I removed the island, at least the terrain variable here from Martinique, and reran it, and it really didn't make a difference. I didn't do it in enough detail to make sure I completely removed all of the different land effects on the atmosphere. So, I think that would be a good avenue of future work, is to a modeling study where we really try to isolate how much of this was caused by land. Because I believe Trey's observational study suggested that at least some of this was partially driven by how the small vortex here interacted with the lee of Martinique. But a lot of it was also convectively driven and by that deep convection as it moved into the Eastern Caribbean. So just to summarize this part, the factors that were key to the early intensification, we had more moisture and upper level divergence on the northeast side. So there were some synoptic differences. And then there was a small but robust core that developed in the stronger member. And again, that was consistent with what we saw in the P3 data. And this member, as a result, showed a lot earlier alignment of the vortex. The precipitation became a lot more symmetric. So what we really seemed to hypothesize and show is that this was convective-based bottom-up vortex alignment. It would seem to be the pathway with maybe some possible aid from terrain, although that's still up in the air. And with this development of that low-level vortex on the northeast side, that put the TC in a more favorable pattern in terms of moisture and divergence. So it seemed like it was a positive feedback between the small-scale vortex scale processes and the more favorable synoptic pattern to the northeast. So we're going to switch gears now and use the same ensemble set to look at the long-term track of Dorian, because that was obviously another real important factor. And these results are in a manuscript that I'm hoping to get into internal review in the next day or two, actually. So we're just wrapping up and putting a few finishing touches on some things. So one of the first things, the first thing we want to look at was, okay, we saw that there was this track deviation in the first 2 days. Maybe, maybe it was just that the rightward members early were the ones that stayed east of Florida. Because in real time, that's kind of what it felt like, that, the fact Dorian missed Florida and stayed installed over the Bahamas was just due to the fact that it did deviate to the right so much so early. So we want to look at that. And so we have correlations here between longitude and latitude. On the top, this is basically the correlation between longitude in blue, latitude in red, with the final longitude at 168 hours. So basically kind of like a serial correlation. And then the same thing with the correlating with the final latitude on the bottom. And so what's interesting is that if you look at this, the correlations between kind of the early longitude and latitude, especially longitude, really don't become significant until about day 3, or at least large. They're statistically significant because of the large sample size, but it really doesn't ramp up. You're really explaining less than 10% of the variance until you get to about day 3 or so. And similar with the longitude and the final latitude as well. And really the latitude only showed a weak relationship with the final longitude throughout. So what this seems to tell us is that overall the early rightward deviation didn't play a huge role in the final track. I mean, it was a little bit, but not nearly as much as we maybe expected going into this study. So that was pretty interesting. And it tells us that, okay, there's some synoptic and other features maybe that were more critical for how the track evolved. And so that's what we'll get into a little bit later. And looking at storm motion, that kind of shows the same story. So again, the variable that we're correlating with is the final longitude on top, latitude on the bottom at 168 hours. So we have storm motion here. So the red on top is the storm speed correlation between U motion and the final longitude, and then purple is the overall storm speed. And then on the bottom, you have the correlation between speed or motion and the final latitude. So again, if you look at these motion versus final longitude correlations, they really weren't significant until about day 3 or so. So again, it's telling that same story that it really wasn't, it wasn't the motion in the first 2 or 3 days that was driving the final longitude. It was what started to happen around day 3 or 4 as it was in the Southwest Atlantic. One thing I wanted to note is that the reversal of this correlation here for latitude was basically due to the fact that you had a set of members that initially, as I'll show in a minute, you had a set that basically started to recurve to the northeast by the time you got to the end of the forecast period. But so basically it tells the same story that what was going on in the Southwest Atlantic was more important for track than that early rightward deviation in the Caribbean. So another way to visualize this ensemble evolution and to see some of how some of the key important times was this ellipse technique that Gus Alaka used. He used this for Joaquin and some other ensemble work he's done. So we applied that to Dorian here, showing the ellipses every 12 hours. You can see, so basically it represents kind of the overall ensemble spread and how much of it is sort of a long track versus a cross track. So what you see, so the stars are the best track here. So what you see is that early on, as we showed when the track plots, the ensemble or the observed track was sort of on the edge of the ensemble guidance for the first couple days. But then by the end of it, it was a lot more kind of in the middle of your suite. And what was interesting also is that if you look at these first couple days, cross track spread was really the dominant term if you look at these ellipses. But then right around day 3 or 84 hours or so, which is, again, when the correlations really picked up, that's when we started to see the spread change to more of a long track spread or a speed difference. And so it really highlights, again, that this period kind of here in the Southwest Atlantic was when things really started to matter for that final track outcome. So to look at this in more detail, working with Michael Fisher, he helped apply kind of a machine learning k-means clustering algorithm to look at different groupings of these members based on the final longitude or the final position, and see which one, how should we separate these to look at in more detail. So we looked at a couple of them. One example was N=3 group that kind of had your landfall or close to Florida landfall members, and then a couple of offshore or Bahamas groups. But the one that we ended up using that had the best silhouette score was this N=5 or K=5 clustering. What this did is it separated into kind of 4 distinct groups that I think well represented what we saw. We had sort of this northwest group in purple, which were the ones that made landfall and progressed all the way across Florida. Then a second sort of landfall group, but that it was a southwest group that did get right up to the coast of Florida and basically either made landfall or basically stalled right along the coast. So that's would have been a pretty scary outcome for Florida, of course, if that had happened. Then you had this northeast group. This was kind of that fast group that I mentioned that recurved a little bit quicker. And then you had this orange group, the southeast group, that was the one that was closest to reality in terms of stalling near or over the northern Bahamas, and also a few outlier cases that we didn't include just because of sample size in the composite analysis that I'll show next. So I have another animation that I'm going to show that illustrates how these different groups evolved over time. I'll play through a couple times. So you can see early on, they're all kind of clustered together. By about day 3, you start to see that speed difference, with the northeast group going faster, and certainly in the Bahamas, you saw big divergence between some of the different groups, especially those orange and reds. I'm going to play through it again. So yeah, just notice how around day north of Hispaniola, you see some divergence, and then as we get into the Bahamas, you really see a speed divergence between those red and orange members. So there's clearly something going on there too that allowed some of them to get into Florida right at the coast and some to stall out over the Bahamas instead. Whoops, let's pause this and go to the next one. So we looked like there were some speed differences, so we calculated that next. So what I have on this slide is motion from the different groups. So the solid lines are the mean from each group, and then the shading is the 95th percentile. The black is the observed motion from best track. So the top is zonal motion, so east-west, middle is meridional, north-south. The bottom is the overall storm speed. So what this shows is that they're pretty similar for the first 3 days. If you look at like the zonal motion and the storm speed, around day 3 or so, you start to see this divergence where the northwest and northeast groups were moving faster to the west by this point. And then the southwest, southeast groups kind of lagged. And then if you look at another key divergence period was here around day 5 or 6, where this is where the red and orange members really started to split, where the orange, the southeast group was closer to reality. It was slower. This red southwest group was a little bit too fast to the west and ended up moving to Florida. One thing I would note is that this green, this was the northeast group, and again that one was the zonal motion was slower by this point because it had already started to recurve. Looking at the meridional motion, the main takeaway is that the northeast group is kind of stands out as being too fast to the north. So that one that was why those got up off the East Coast so quickly. And it's looking at the overall speed, again, it kind of shows the importance of that 84-hour divergence period for the two northern groups, and then the 120 to 144-hour divergence point between the red and the orange between the southeast and southwest in terms of storm speed. So to get into what the synoptic features were that were responsible for causing these differences, we applied an ensemble sensitivity analysis that Ryan Torn has pioneered. This has been used, he's used this for cases like Debbie and Sandy and Joaquin. Obviously, Dorian wasn't as much of a bifurcation case like some of those were, where you had ensemble members going opposite directions. But certainly, there was a lot of spread, a lot of uncertainty, and so it was a useful case to study, what were the large-scale features that the track was most sensitive to. This sensitivity is defined as dj dx. It's basically the covariance between j and x divided by the variance in x, where j is your forecast metric that you're looking at, and then x is the ensemble field that you want to determine the sensitivity to. And for the purposes of this study, we use for that j for the forecast metric, it's basically that final position east-west at 168 hours, kind of what we've been looking at throughout. And we applied to the anomaly relative to the ensemble mean. X, what we use for X is the ensemble geopotential height fields at different levels and times. I'm going to show 500 millibars here for the sake of brevity, but in the paper we're also going to do 300 millibars. They kind of tell the same story. So we're only doing for these plots, we're only going to shade areas that are significant at the 90% level, and areas at 95% will also be hatched, just to highlight the features that are statistically significant and most critical. So what was interesting is, initially there really wasn't a huge signal. It wasn't like there was a big sensitivity in the initial fields, maybe a little bit on the north side here as you started to see some, the Atlantic wave train evolve. So one thing I'll note is that in these plots, the contours will be the mean 500 millibar height from the ensemble. And then reds will indicate areas, like here at 24 hours, reds will indicate areas where higher geopotential height basically meant storm ended up further west. Blue indicates areas where lower geopotential height there meant the storm ended up further west. So that's how you can kind of think about how this works. So at 24 hours, you're starting to see hints of sensitivity to the subtropical ridge, so stronger ridge further west. You're also seeing some of this influence of the ridging over the U.S. and some of this maybe remote influence of what was going on over the Northeast Atlantic as Tropical Storm Erin was recurving there. So skipping ahead to 84 hours, this was kind of that big key divergence point that we saw in the speed. You see this big area of statistical significance associated with the subtropical ridge, where a stronger ridge here, northeast of the TC, meant that the storm ended up further west. Also seeing some sensitivity to storm position right here as well, where a few of these members are already a little bit further west by this point. Skipping ahead to 96 hours, we still see that sensitivity to the subtropical ridge and kind of the downstream influence over the North Atlantic. What was also starting to show up, though, is a statistically significant signal over the United States, where higher heights here basically would have meant the storm got further west. And what this was associated with was a trough, a shortwave trough that formed over the plains moved into the eastern U.S. And you can kind of see that in the ensemble mean fields here. So if this had been weaker, basically weaker, the weaker this was, Dorian would have ended up further west. And when we look at some mean fields, some actual fields in a minute, you'll see that. At 120 hours, you're starting to get this big red blob north of the TC as it approaches the Bahamas. So higher, stronger subtropical ridge and a stronger eastern U.S. ridge, or at least a weaker shortwave, meant that Dorian would end up further west. Of course, you're seeing a bit of a dipole here with the position by this point. What's also interesting is you saw that this negative relationship showing up with the subtropical, or with the ridge over the western United States. So the stronger ridge here basically seemed to amplify this downstream trough and allow Dorian to recurve. And so that was the reason for that sort of inverse relationship there. And by 144 hours, it's again pretty similar to 120. You have this massive red blob north of the storm where, so basically stronger heights here, storm would have ended up further west, weaker heights here, stronger trough, storm recurves, stays offshore. So it's sort of what we anticipated, that the subtropical ridge would be important, but I thought it was pretty interesting how it also showed the importance of this upstream ridge and trough pattern over the United States. So to look at those details a little bit more, kind of like we did for the structure, we looked at 4 individual members for the track, 1 for each group. We have the northwest member, it hit Florida as a major hurricane and then moved across the state. The northeast member was kind of offshore to the northeast, stalled east of Jacksonville. The southwest member was one of those, it became a major hurricane. It stalled out right over West Palm Beach, basically. So, kind of one of those that got right up to the coast before stalling. And then the southeast member was very close to observations, where it basically stalled over Great Abaco and Grand Bahama as a major hurricane. And what was interesting between these two, between these several different members, was that you saw you didn't see a huge signal to the early track. I mean, even the ones that ended up hitting Florida were kind of on the eastern side of the ensemble suite in this case. So it gave us confidence that, again, it wasn't just the early track affecting the overall outcome. So then if we look at the individuals, looking at the individual storm motion here, this is kind of similar to what we showed with the group means, but now we have just plot for the individual members. I want to note that I did a 12-hour smoothing because otherwise it was really noisy with these individual members. But looking at the zonal motion, you see, again, the northwest and northeast members, kind of were a lot faster to the west initially. And then you kind of saw this split between the southwest and southeast members. They were basically on top of each other for a while. So it was just that final 24 hours or 48 hours right before the potential landfall in Florida was where those two started to kind of split. Again, the northeast member was similar to the northeast group. It was too fast meridionally. And looking at overall speed, those northeast and northwest groups or members were clearly too fast. The southwest and southeast were a lot closer to reality for the first 4 or 5 days, and then that split at the end was really what determined whether the storm approached Florida or not. So finally, we look at the synoptic height or fields to look at the evolution of the subtropical ridge and just highlight the details of why some of these features were and how they were different between the members. So we have what I have plotted here, the solid contours basically showing the subtropical ridge. The dashed line is the trough pattern over the U.S. I have the 84-hour position of the TC and the different members plotted here, and then the final position there for reference. And so what you see is that the 300 millibar ridge, what was interesting was that, because the black line is the GFS analysis, and it's basically observations, what was the western flank of the subtropical ridge was actually too weak in several of the HAFS members. And that's sort of a bias we see in a lot of HAFS cases. But the northeast of the TC kind of, imparting this steering influence on it on the northeast side, it was a little bit weaker. And that was what we saw in these red and orange members, the two southerly groups that were, not too fast. So it seems like that the strength of the ridge to the northeast was sort of critical for letting it move slower at this point, and why it didn't get so fast to the northwest. So then if we then go to our other key divergence point at 144 hours, again, you have the positions shown and the trough and ridge. What was interesting was that if you look now, you can see that if you look at the observations, you see that there's clearly this short wave trough over the eastern U.S. It's not sharp enough in any of the HAFS runs, but the southwest and southeast did show the most accurate representation of it. So that deeper trough was pretty critical for allowing the storm to stall and turn north here. But some other key differences that stand out are, you see that in the red, the southwest member that did end up hitting Florida, you see there's a lot stronger ridging over the southwest Atlantic to the northeast here still. Whereas in reality that ridge had eroded more by this point, and that was better reflected in the southeast member as well. So it really seemed like that it was this the erosion of the subtropical ridge and this trough to the north in that final 24 to 48 hours that allowed Dorian to stall and eventually begin moving to the north. So to summarize the key factors in the long-term track is that the early northward motion, surprisingly, really didn't seem to be a key player in this ensemble set, at least in terms of for the long-term track. So that was probably one of the most surprising things we found, because we found that the track divergence between the ensemble members really didn't start until about 3 or 4 days into this simulations. And the track, it was highly sensitive to the position and strength of the Atlantic subtropical ridge. That's not surprising. That's a key steering influence in this region. But there was also a lot of sensitivity to how that upstream trough evolved over the eastern United States. So it really seems like Dorian stalled in the Bahamas due to 3 key factors that we saw. The subtropical ridge over the Atlantic, it weakened to the northeast of the TC as it moved north of the Antilles, and that slowed it down. The ridge over the western U.S. developed, which slowed the western movement and also forced the downstream troughing. And that trough, that shortwave, amplifying the eastern U.S. trough, kind of helped erode the western flank of the subtropical ridge, eventually causing Dorian to stall and turn to the north. So in conclusion, and just thinking of how this could be applied in the future, we used that large HAFS ensemble. It was a really unique data set to study a challenging, complex case. The ensemble really showed that for the intensity, there was a lot of complex interaction between vortex scale and large scale processes that led to the early reorganization and reformation intensification of Dorian. That long-term track really seemed to be dictated by 2 key synoptic features, the subtropical ridge positioning and strength, and then that trough over the eastern US. So what this really shows is that for intensification, it's really important to be able to isolate the importance of vortex scale versus large scale processes and understand how those interact. And that's something that's ongoing. And I thought it would be really interesting to apply this methodology to current and future versions of the HAFS ensemble experiments that are being run as part of the DA experiments, and see how can we apply this, even if it's not quite at 3-kilometer resolution, to maybe understand some of this in near real time. Because high resolution ensembles, it's certainly a valuable tool for research, and as computer power continues to advance, hopefully in the future this would be something we could apply to forecasting and to answer any questions that people might have.
Thank you, Andy, for that wonderful presentation. Looks like we have several questions and a healthy discussion happening on the chat. Let me scroll back to a few of the questions, and you're welcome
to
you could,
maybe find the questions, because I'm just starting to kind of
I know, yeah. There's plenty of good discussion happening, lots of comments and suggestions. Let me see, there was one earlier from Frank Marks, and he had suggested, is there any diurnal signal in the convective developments? And some folks have addressed that question, but I'll give you the floor here to insert your own comments as well.
Yeah, let me go back to that part. Let me see where we're at. So yeah, if you look at the time series of plots here, I mean, you definitely see some cycles that are look diurnal, or at least quasi-diurnal. This closure diagram focused more on the inner core closure. So I'm guessing that that's not quite as sensitive. I bet if I looked at something like out at 200 kilometers, you would see a greater signal. But certainly it does look like there's some, even in the strong member, which down the bottom where you saw a clear trend, you see some clear diurnal or semi-diurnal oscillations happening. So.
All right, we've got another question from Rob. He, in a comment there, interesting question to me is also the relative importance of environmental versus inner core characteristics in governing predictability, and how that varies from case to case, and how I'll just tie
Okay.
this in as well, and how observations can help reduce that uncertainty and what types of observations.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Rob. And so, that's kind of what we were getting at with the sensitivity analysis, for the track. I was thinking, we didn't do this for the first pair. I mean, another future work might be you could go back and do some kind of sensitivity analysis for the intensity too, because you can really plug in any kind of forecast metric you want here. And I thought that was pretty interesting, to look at, because that was kind of surprising to me. I was surprised, at least for the track, how little sensitivity there was to the initialization. Certainly for the intensity, there was some sensitivity to those early moisture and divergence fields, but it was, it seemed like it was the convective organization, how it evolved in the first day or so, that was really important.
Comment and a suggestion from Philippe Pepin. And Andy really liked the sensitivity analysis using 500 millibar heights, but also might be useful to perform same analyses using the steering layer depth flow, maybe like 850, 200 hectopascal mean layer depth, or whatever best captures the motion of Dorian in the model analysis grids.
Yeah, thanks, Philippe. That's a really good suggestion. Somebody, I think Ryan Torn actually made the same comment. He's a co-author on the paper. And so I won't get too much in the weeds, but kind of, calculating the optimal steering is sort of the last piece that we're hoping to add as it's in internal review and before we submit it. We're having we're going back and forth trying to figure out what the best way to calculate the steering is, because we're seeing some mismatch between the motion and the steering that we didn't expect. So if we can get the steering flow calculated correctly and be confident in that, I think we may try that, because I think you're right, that would be really interesting. I see Rob's follow-up comment here that that you could look at sensitivity of intensity of tilt or something like that. That's interesting. I mean, I think that's that might just be like more of a straight correlation analysis, and I did a little bit of that, but maybe not a full analysis. So, and Jason's comment about the observed, there was an observed downward cycle, and that's kind of what I was thinking, is that if you looked further out, you might see less of just the semi-diurnal. It might be clearer, but for this particular analysis, we're focused on the inner core.
All right, there's one discussion here that they want to hear from you. It started with Gus saying, one thing that has confused us is that the TC motion for some members is faster than the flow at all levels. We're not sure what is causing that. Any ideas? And so Sim asked, faster in what way? Remember to add beta to the flow to get the motion. So if the system is moving 1 to 2 meters per second faster to the northwest, that is probably why. And so they want to hear from you on your remarks on that, what you think the differences are.
Yeah, we are still trying to figure that out. We did think about beta. That could be part of it, because it was moving to the northwest. The differences were maybe more like 2 meters per second in a couple cases, and basically the optimal steering layer was just shallower than we were expecting. And so one thing that I did notice was that this period here was when we're seeing some of the bigger differences was sort of while the ensemble or the observation was east of most of our members. So it doesn't surprise me that there was some difference with observations, but what's still surprising to me is how we're even in the just looking at the model data itself, there's a bit of a mismatch between the optimal steering level. It's kind of showing, the results we're finding are showing that it's like the 850 to 700 millibar layers is optimal, and that's not really what you'd expect for a developing hurricane like this. It's still kind of that's something, kind of the final piece that we're hoping to add to the puzzle. And I see Jason had a question that is super sensitive to observing system experiments very early in its life. And I think that quantifying the degree of moisture uncertainty and in maybe some of the all the upper level winds kind of east of Puerto Rico, that would have been really important. And so it was, and certainly better inner core obs there would have been helpful as well. We had a lot, but the more getting that to the model is better. And James Franklin made a good comment that the model should produce its own beta flow as long as you're measuring the steering close to the center. Yeah, James, that's another point. I think Ryan made the point. I mean, for the steering that we're doing, and I didn't show the steering plots again because I wasn't confident in it yet, but we're averaging, we're doing 3 degrees on either side from the center. It's not that big, but maybe we need to shrink it down even further, do like a degree or 2 or something, and see if that produces better results. Shirley, were there any other questions that you saw?
That was pretty much it. It looks like there's one that Rob Rogers has that. It says, I guess the uncertainty, variability, oops, it just went off my screen, heightened for weakened systems, correct? Right?
Yeah, definitely, because I think, when you have a center that's, I mean, let me go back to the radar plots. You have this very broad, diffuse, and tilted system. So it's, what is the center even at this early point? So it's almost like you could almost, I think, make a decent argument that what occurred in the Eastern Caribbean was, I mean, we called it a reformation, but in a sense, it was almost like a genesis. I mean, it was already classified as a TC, but I remember being on the P3 flights, and one of those flights, I think it may have been this one right here. It was hard to find a low-level center. It was almost opening up into a wave, and that's sort of what a lot of the dynamical models, even an aggressive model like HWRF was showing, was just opening up into a wave, moving into Hispaniola, and we saw something like that this year with Grace and Fred and stuff. But you got this convection, and down kind of northeast reformation, and sort of almost like a regenesis of the storm. So certainly, yeah, these broad early stage systems are very uncertain. So.
All right, Andy, looks like we still have a few comments, but I'll go ahead and open the floor if anyone wants to unmute and personally ask Andy their own question.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestions, everyone. This is good discussion. So let me know if there's anything else.
Hey, Andy, this is James Franklin.
Yes.
So I mentioned it up there earlier in the comment, but I found particularly the first part interesting but discouraging, in the sense that it seemed as though fairly modest differences in moisture and upper level divergence caused very different kinds of evolution in a way that made it hard for me to see how we could productively sort that out in real time. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the forecast implications of the large differences in evolution from seemingly modest differences in initial conditions.
Yeah, that's a really good point, James, because you have these slight position differences, but huge moisture differences that lead to wildly different outcomes. And it's moisture can be hard to quantify in this area. I mean, probably the caveat on all this, of course, is that while the sample size is large in the sense that it's an 80-member ensemble, it's a small sample size, and then it's one storm at one initialization. So I think to definitively answer that from a forecast perspective, you need to apply something like this at least over the course of the season or something. I mean, we have the 6-kilometer HAFS ensemble data from last year. Maybe you could look at that and see if there's any notable signals, if there's any consistency. But yeah, certainly, I think if like Rob mentioned, there's just some inherent uncertainty with these weak cases that might make it kind of hard, at least with the current observation systems we have. So.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Andy, I don't see any additional questions, just a lot of discussion and comments. So thank you again, Andy. And thank you for joining. Again, if you missed part of the seminar, it's being recorded and available in a week or so on our AOML website. Thank you again for joining. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Shirley. Thank you, everyone.